Hey y'all, thanks for tuning in yet again. I still have not found anything to say in replacement of that, so I'm just going to keep saying it. I'm not even going to give myself a hard time about it. I am thankful that you've tuned in again. This is going very well. I need some more coffee. Okay, I've got some, don't worry. We're good to go. Thank you for tuning in. Today I want to talk about vesting. And there's a couple things I want to keep in mind. First off, I think this is important to talk about because I've seen vesting agreements, vesting schedules, etc. become really popular over the past couple of years with startups especially. Founders are using them as a means to ensure that their employees are being properly compensated. So you see them in a lot of situations where maybe the startup doesn't have the financial resources to be paying an employee or co-founder, whoever it is, full market value for their services and for their contribution. So they'll provide some sort of exchange of equity or stock option grants in order to get that individual a little closer to fair market value for the work that they're doing. Another situation you see it being used in is when a founder or a startup wants their contractors or their employees, their co-founders, to have a little skin in the game, right? Everyone tends to work harder. We as humans tend to work harder when we have some personal interest in the situation. So this provides a way for those individuals, those key employees, to feel like they're contributing to something that they also actively benefit from and can benefit from going forward into the future. That being said, why do vesting schedules or vesting agreements tend to get really complicated? Well, there's a lot of terms that are used as terms of art that people misunderstand or misapply or just casually throw around for a variety of circumstances because they don't fully understand what they're supposed to be used for and what context they're supposed to be used. That if you haven't tuned in to the Shit Your Lawyer Says podcast, it's kind of the basis of the entire podcast, is to take terms or concepts that have generally been misunderstood or misapplied with business owners, founders, employees, etc., and explain what it is they mean. Because if I have an individual as an attorney come into my office and say, I want a vesting agreement with this key employee, I want it to have this cliff and these terms, blah, 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 blah. To the extent that you come into my office and you're using terms of art, I am going to assume to some extent that you understand what you're talking about. Now I say that, I have since learned, when I was a baby lawyer, I assumed assumed, let's see how many times I can use the word assumed in one sentence. If you did that, I interpreted that as you had some base level understanding of the agreement and what its function was and what it did. And obviously, as any other professional or especially an attorney can tell you, as we get more experience and we grow up, we realize that people throw these terms around all the time. And just because you said the word vesting or the word cliff does not mean you actually understand what you're asking for or are asking for what you really want. So people throw these terms around. I have literally had conversations with founders recently where they have asked for very specific terms in relation to vesting agreements or schedules, and come to find out they didn't really have any concept of what that provision meant or how it interacted with the rest of the provisions. So I want to address all those things. The second major issue to keep in mind as a primer to what I'm going to talk about is that vesting can apply in really two scenarios. One is where you're vesting actual equity, which means I'm giving you equity or ownership in the entity without any secondary requirement or consideration or exchange of value in response to that gift of equity. Well, not a gift, but in response to that transfer of equity. The second is you can also grant stock options. So traditionally, you would have seen a grant of stock options in a vesting type situation with corporate executives, high-level employees, things of that nature. This isn't going well. So I'm in my classroom, one of the classrooms I teach at the university, and the lights are timed, so when I stand in this space for too long, the lights shut off and then I couldn't get it to start, so I was just jumping around. If you had seen it, it probably would have been really amusing. Anyways, thanks for sticking around while the lights went out on me. Hopefully it won't happen again. But vesting schedules are not new. The concept of vesting ownership or options to an individual within the organization is not a new concept. Previously, we had seen it mostly in relation to stock options as opposed to actual equity. So keep in mind that you can vest options, you can vest straight equity. It depends on what you want to facilitate, what kind of the underlying purpose of the vesting is, and all of that fun stuff. So with that primer out of the way, that took up almost 6 minutes. I want to get into some key terms. First being the cliff. A lot of people will say the word cliff. It's become popularized in describing a particular type of event. So what is the cliff as it relates to vesting? The cliff is the date upon which, the triggering event upon which an individual has access to whatever it is that they're being granted, either their equity or their options. So for example, if my vesting schedule has a 1-year cliff, that means that I have to work for the company for 1 year before I have access to those grants or that equity. That's important to keep in mind because depending on how the schedule is structured, if I'm in an at-will employment situation, then I may not actually be guaranteed to any equity or options at all. Because if I get fired on day 360 out of 365, then I have a right to nothing a lot of times. That's an important thing to keep in mind, I think, because a lot of employees don't realize that. A lot of key people don't realize that, and then when they get fired at the end of the year, or before the end of the year, which unfortunately is common in some situations, when they get fired before the end of the year, they expect to be able to take some of that interest with them, and they can't because they haven't hit their cliff date. So the cliff date is the triggering event or the date upon which you see these rights begin to be accessed by the individual. Standard term, in most startups or in a lot of situations, you will see a 1-year cliff, meaning that individual needs to work for the company for a year before they have access to any of that interest. The next term relates to the terms of the vesting itself. So in this instance, we have two, when we're talking about, okay, we've hit the cliff, and now we have access to whatever it is being granted, either the equity or the options. We have two categories that end up forming. The first is based on the terms. So standard terms is to say it vests 1/48 over 48 months, right? So you get 1/48 of your equity or options fully vest on the first of each month for 48 months. So what does that create in terms of categories of interest? It creates now this one category of interest which we have a right to because it has been triggered, we've reached the triggering event, and then there's a second category of interest which has fully vested. The way that any individual agreement handles these two categories of rights really varies by agreement. Sometimes you'll see that if you leave prior to full vesting, you do not have any rights related to anything that hasn't fully vested. Sometimes you'll see that the company has a right to reimburse or repurchase the options. Sometimes you have a set amount of time after you've left to be able to exercise those options. It really varies by contract and by the parties involved. And that leads me into my final point, which is it's extremely important that you have a professional draft these documents. I don't say that for my own benefit. Go to anyone that it is you normally work with. The point is have a professional at least look it over. Why is that so important? Because these really are key provisions and documents for your entity. If they're not properly drafted or not properly phrased or defined, you could end up giving away significantly more equity than you anticipated. I've seen people accidentally give away 80% of a right in their company because they were not conscious and they attempted to draft and define all of the terms themselves. without having them looked over by a professional. So have someone look over it to ensure that you are actually effectuating what it is you want to effectuate. And in the midst of that conversation, hopefully you'll keep some of these things in mind to recognize that you do have a lot of options and a lot of flexibility when it comes to how you are structuring these agreements. And that makes them a really valuable tool, but it also makes them a huge potential pitfall for people that attempt to do them themselves. So be aware of what it is you're vesting, be aware of what those terms specify and what those terms actually entail in both best case and worst case scenario, and keep in mind the long-term goals and benefit of the company, especially because I do see people either accidentally or purposefully grant sometimes large amount of equity to key employees at the time. The employee ends up leaving, and now we have 30% of the company that's just wandering around out in the world but not actively contributing to anything that the company's doing. So be aware of what the long-term goals and vision is for the company, and keep all of that stuff in mind as you go about drafting your agreement, preferably with a professional. But with that, I'm done.